So this is my mind map on the 4 Jungian archetypes of masculinity. It is drawing largely from the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover from Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. Full disclosure before I start talking about it, I am not an enormous fan of I would not identify myself as a Jungian psychologist, in that I don't think that archetypes accurately describe the world. However, I do think that archetypes are an interesting way of stylizing one's own action and way of interpreting the world. And on that basis, I think they're useful, but they don't necessarily describe the world in an objective or corresponding sort of way. I don't think they're eternal, and I don't think all stories relate to the archetypes. But I think you can use the archetypes to relate to to interpret any story. So the archetypes are universally applicable, but stories do not necessarily have embedded in them archetypes, is my general position. So let's jump right in. There are 4 archetypes, and the most important one, or the one to cover first, is the king, because the king is the central archetype. In order to achieve the king energy, you need to have all the other 3 archetypes working together in order to properly achieve it. So the king is an organizing force, and it is central. And the book heavily emphasizes that the king's energy is not his own, but is some primal energy that extends beyond him. At some point, the king's energy will leave him, and he will have to, in some way, abdicate. Now, every single one of these archetypes has 2 shadow formats. One that is either too polarized or not polarized enough. So the weaker or the not polarized enough shadow of the king is the weakling, and he is disidentified from any sort of kingly energy, and he is paranoid about his power. And the stronger form is the tyrant, and instead of being generous and constructive like the king, the tyrant is destructive, and he operates from a place of fear, and instead of loving the people who are beneath him, he hates them. And eventually the tyrant's power inspires. He fears people rightly so, because he inspires hatred from the people he rules. So, next on the list is the warrior. And the warrior is the one of action. If you. The warrior is centrally an aggressive force and is about having energy and committing action, and it is distinct from the immature version of the warrior, the hero, which isn't covered in this mind map, in that it knows its limitations. So the immature version of the warrior just seeks out and acts, but the warrior is more, the adult version is more discerning and is capable of knowing their limits, and is very controlled, and they're also generally committed to a higher purpose of some sort, whether it be a nation, a cause, or something of that effect. And by being so controlled, one of the downsides of even a properly emulated warrior is that they tend to be more detached. The shadow forms of the warrior are the masochist and the sadist. The masochist is the depolarized, and the masochist grows to hate themselves because they fail on their own standards and project their frustrations inward. They punish themselves, and they are generally insecure, although they might lash out in a warrior-like way. The sadist, unlike the warrior, doesn't have a central mission or something that they're committed to, and instead of viewing themselves as a guardian or a protector, they hate the weak, and they lack self-control. So that's the warrior. The magician is the force that is identified with knowing, technology, and initiation into masculinity through ritual, which the book heavily emphasizes that's something that is missing in contemporary society. So they make an appeal towards the magician force in that there's a need for masculine ritual. Um, the magician is the master of technology, but it is juxtaposed with the warrior in that they are not capable of taking action generally, or they are more detached from the action. Instead, the magician's more of the part of the ego that observes and also involves somewhat more intuitive knowing, although I think that belongs more to the lover, but we'll get to that. The shadow versions of the magician are the denying innocent one and the manipulator. Again, these are all ordered so that the weak polarization is on top and the strong is on the bottom. So the denying innocent one doesn't try to learn as a practice, and they might have a good amount of knowledge, but they learn just to the extent where they can use it to offset or derail others, and then they're not committed to the learning after that. So they shrink away from the responsibilities of a magician to learn knowledge, impart knowledge, and guide others, and instead learning just enough that they could get by. So the manipulator doesn't want to help other people. Instead, they withhold help, and help from the magician is generally in the form of information. They don't act, but that admittedly is a characteristic of the magician themselves normally. They think too much, they operate too much inside their own head, and this leads to the inaction. Paralysis versus analysis. And one of the interesting things I thought the book mentioned was that Jung himself thought of himself as a magician, which, when analyzing these archetypes, should be something that is taken into consideration. So then we have the lover, and the lover kind of obviously is going to fill in the gaps that are left by the magician and the warrior. So their characteristics are that they're passion, they experience the world in a very vivid way, and general aliveness or joyousness is coming from the magician. Sensual pleasure is something the magician is holding as important, which if you look at the warrior, there's an opposition because the warrior's emotionally detached. And if you look at the magician also is in opposition because they're focused more on knowing and information. And so there's a tension between these three, but ideally to achieve your masculine self and also achieve the king archetype, you need all three of these. So it's about resolving tension and working them all together. The lover is the empathetic one. So insofar as you are going to get the generosity and the generative powers of the king, you need to have empathy. The lover often shrinks away from convention, and so you're not going to get as much ritual as much as you are moving through a deeper, more feeling sort of intuition rather than a knowing sort of intuition. The two forms of the lover that are the shadow selves are the impotent lover for the weak form and the addicted for the strong form. The impotent lover is disconnected from life. They're often depressed and unfeeling, and so that's not good, obviously. The addicted instead tries to fill a void in themselves with sensual pleasure, and the book argues that that attempt to fill the void only extends the void. What they need is order and boundaries. They need some warrior energy to bring them back in line. The book talks about a Don Juan syndrome, where instead of operating with empathy with regards to sensual pleasure, the individual who is addicted instead views people as flesh rather than as persons. The addicted is restless and lost in their pursuit of sensual pleasure, so they're cut off from their purpose, which is, again, a warrior type of energy. And so when you think about all these in tandem, you notice it's about managing the tension between these things, because most of the shadow versions are kind of an inadequacy from a different archetype. So, like the shadow versions of the lover need the warrior to write it, and the shadow versions of the magician need the warrior, and the shadow versions of the warrior need the lover. And I thought this was an interesting way of looking at things. Overall, the archetypes seem fairly robust in their ability to describe phenomena and make attributions, and they're also very stylized in that the 4 different archetypes are very distinct from each other, and so they allow you to try and work on them independently if you're going to approach these archetypes with some degree of intentionality. One of the interesting exercises that the book suggests is having conversations with these others. So with these archetypes. So what you do is you create a dialogue between the two, between, like, let's say ego and lover. So you just do E colon, and then your ego's like, hey, what's up? And then L colon, lover responds, etc. And you sort of explore how your idealized version of this archetype interacts with who you think you are, and you use that as a basis for guiding you. I tried that exercise out. It seems fairly interesting. And overall, these archetypes are interesting. I know that Jung was generally very interested in reversals or negations or opposite sides, like the animus being the feminine wild force that is the reverse of the more active masculine ego. So, but this is not straight from Jung. It is from Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette, although it seems consistent with Jung's ideology. And I think that's about it. So